A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking the time out to be with us for this webinar, which is titled, our topic today is Why Environment Liabilities Matter under Indian M&A. I am your Master of Ceremonies, Mayank Singh, partner with the Corporate Practice Group of Khaitan Company. Um, why is this webinar important or topical today? Environment is very relevant. It is political. It has reputational issues. It could have several kind of implications for you in terms of civil, criminal, including director liability. Therefore, environmental concerns are extremely important today, and also from a perspective of consumer backlash that you may face as a result of certain transactions that you engage in. Our agenda is set out on the screen, which you will be able to view. Just to remind everyone, the format that we are following is to take questions at the end of the webinar, but the portal will have a section for you to submit your questions, which will be open now. So please feel free to send in as many questions as you like on topics that are relevant for you follow in basis this presentation today. Introducing our panelists, we have a very interesting set of people. Aditya Patni, who is part of the corporate practice group and looks at M&A situations. Usually, from a corporate standpoint, would be the first port of call, and therefore he would be the one who would be telling you about what are the various things that you need to keep in mind, be it from a diligence perspective, be it in terms of engaging or in terms of scoping diligence, as well as reflecting those in documents in terms of reps and warranties, indemnities, condition precedents, etc., and documentation. Then I have my partner Navneet, who handles the regulatory and the dispute side of environment, and he has had the experience of dealing with across several forums and contentious issues, and brings in the specialist advice that we need to understand what the liabilities truly mean for you in terms of the broad framework that we discussed, from criminal, civil, etc. And finally, I have Rahul Mehta with me, who is transaction lead at ERM India. Rahul will come in to talk about the technical side of things, which is that whether the actual affluents, etc., or the environment law compliance from a technical and factual side of things is what are the things that are important to keep in mind. What do you do in case if there are contamination issues, and how do you solve for? So therefore, this panel should be able to give you a complete picture of important aspects so far as environment liabilities or in an M&A transaction are concerned. Without taking more time, I will now hand over the session to Aditya, who's our first speaker.
Thank you for setting the context, Mayank. In the first section of this webinar titled Environmental Risk Identification, we'll be covering the following issues. Right. In any M&A transaction, especially one involving a target that is exposed to enhanced environmental legislation, environment due diligence can provide critical information on identification and quantification of known, unknown, and contingent environmental risks and liabilities that may be relevant for the target and or its properties. The diligence exercise also helps in identifying other actionable environmental issues, which may be in the form of changes in processes or systems, remedial action, capital expenditure, or may otherwise be classified as deal breakers. The diligence exercise also helps in developing a risk management, mitigation, and elimination strategy, and which basically will help you ensure that the identified risks are appropriately dealt with and value can be protected. The diligence exercise also helps in dictating the key legal terms and conditions for a transaction, and issues such as conditions precedent, indemnity items, scope of representation warranties, covenants and undertakings are fleshed out pursuant to the diligence exercise. Finally, the diligence exercise also helps in developing a term risk management plan, which includes post-closing issues leading right up to strategic exits, if any, that are relevant for that deal. We'll now look at some of the key objectives of conducting an environment diligence. And I think one of the most key objectives of this diligence exercise is to ensure that the value that you pay for the target is verified and it reflects the true value that you're looking for. Given that environmental issues can have serious consequences, both in terms of financial consequences or reputational and social consequences, it becomes very important to understand the issues that may be relevant to your deal and deal with them in the most appropriate manner. The diligence exercise also helps in allocation of risks between the parties. For instance, a well-advised buyer who has comfort on diligence may be okay to accept lesser contractual protections, but if serious concerns are identified, in that case, it may not be eager to go ahead with a particular transaction. Similarly, a seller, before going to market, if it perceives environmental issues with the property that it is trying to sell, it may undertake an environment diligence, and this will help the seller evaluate prospective bids or the indemnity and reps and warranty packages that may be offered by bidders more efficiently. We'll now look at some of the preliminary considerations that are relevant in conducting environment diligence. Right up front is the scope of diligence. Given that the scope of diligence will be guided by various factors such as the type and industry of the target, location of the site, processes involved, waste generated, it is important to get a factual background so that your environment diligence can focus on the right items. Another important aspect is timely involvement of external consultants and counsels. Based on our experience, we've seen that environment diligence is not really something which is taken upfront, but generally is started much after the legal diligence exercise is started. But in industries which has extensive environment legislation, I think it is important to engage external environment consultants right at the upfront so that the process can be managed diligently and value can be protected. Another important aspect is duplication of efforts. I think in any environment diligence exercise, you will have external advisors like counsels and technical advisors, and it's important to allocate scope of responsibility between these two sets of advisors so that there's no duplication of effort. And a logical allocation would mean that the technical expert looks at remediation and technical issues, whereas the legal counsel really looks at contractual issues, compliance issues, litigation issues, and so on. Finally, I think it's very important that the advisors that you finally engage to advise you on these matters are able to come up with cost estimate reports in the form of ranges or point estimates based on the probability of occurrence. And these could be in the form of remediation costs or costs relating to settlement of litigations or third-party claims. This slide is basically designed to provide you with an overview of the environmental risk framework, which may be relevant in the M&A context. For the ease of your understanding, we have tried to divide the environmental risk into three different categories. On the left side, you have backward-looking risks, which are really legacy risks, and they become important in Indian context because India does not have a law to deal with a historical pollution on land, and therefore, if pursuant to an M&A transaction, you end up acquiring certain portion of land, you end up becoming its acquirer, and you're therefore responsible under Indian law for any historic issues, environment issues as well. The second bucket of risks we've identified are present looking, which are really compliance issues. So for instance, what kind of laws are applicable to you? How are you equipped to deal with them? Are your license all updated? Do they allow you to function the way that you currently do? Are all items which fall in this middle bucket. And then finally, on the right side, we have forward-looking risks or sustainability risks, which would mean different things to different parties and to different transactions. But I think the idea is your environment diligence exercise should account for the different risks that are presented in any environment diligence and are scoped in an appropriate manner. We'll now look at some of the key consequences of not identifying environmental risks. And while the slide lists out the main consequences, I'll touch upon some of them. Business interruption is very much possible pursuant to an environmental issue. Authorities are equipped to instruct stoppage of operations if they foresee an environmental issue. Third-party litigations are also very common if there are environmental issues, and likewise the possibility of fines, penalty, and penal consequences arising out of non-compliance with law is also an important aspect. We've already touched upon remediation issues, but of course there are other issues such as credit assessment. Very often lenders will want to have different terms if your environment framework is not to their liking.
Like Adit just mentioned, that it's important to identify the environmental risks, and because they can of course lead to liability in all forms. And if you're talking about the M&A transactions, what we need to keep in mind is there is a whole lot of liability for parties if they do not disclose information when it comes to these instances of pollution. And be it the Environment Act, be it the Air Act or the Water Act, these are some of the Indian legislations. They all provide for such forms of liability. Now, if you're talking about hazardous waste or handling any hazardous substance, of course, the hazardous and other waste management and transboundary movement rules, they clearly provide that if at all there is any accident which occurs, there is an obligation for you to report. And of course, there is a whole lot of liability when it comes to improper handling and management of such waste. Now, one important aspect about the Indian jurisdiction is that the laws actually provide for absolute liability when it comes to inherently dangerous activities. And there are absolutely no exceptions when it comes to any of these entities who actually indulge in handling hazardous substances in case a liability arises. For companies, what becomes important is, of course, there is a whole lot of liability attached to the occupier or the operator. And many a times, if you talk about the occupier, it's the directors who are actually seen to be occupiers. Now, if it comes to the liability framework, one of the important aspects is that, the criteria on which the courts have actually determined as to how do you fix a liability. And one of the important aspects is, of course, the turnover of the company and the category in which the company falls under. So clearly, we've had instances where, a certain company, which if it falls in the red category or is seen to be inherently handling sort of like, say, substances which are hazardous or dangerous, then of course the liability attached to such companies in terms of fines or compensation is much more than any other company which would fall in a different category and is not seen to be that dangerous. And the courts have unanimously, and when I say courts, I refer to the Supreme Court of India, they've had a whole lot of judgments where they've actually said that if you're actually
indulging in activities which are inherently dangerous, or the chances of you or your activity causing harm to the environment is much higher, then clearly the liability is of course on you to make sure that you make good all the damage which has been done to the environment. Uh, if you see, look at this slide, what we've tried doing is we've actually tried identifying some of the key issues across sectors when it comes to environment. And if you have a look at these, you'll find that the environmental clearance, the issues with respect to consents, the consent to establish and the consent to operate, the specific and the general conditions which are attached to these clearances and consents. Now, they of course become very important across sectors. Now, additionally, if depending on the nature of the activity and the sector in which a particular industry falls under, there are certain other kinds of issues which crop up from time to time. For example, we've had issues with respect to usage and import of pet coke for the cement industry. We've had issues with respect to cleanup when it comes to the chemicals and the pharmaceutical industries in the past. Now, we've had one common issue which comes across all the time is, of course, the whole issue with respect to zero liquid discharge, ZLD. So, these are just indicative issues. Many of them remain, of course, common. But say, for example, if you're talking about, say, an FMCG sector, and if you have a cola company, of course, the issue with respect to groundwater usage becomes important. So there is a whole range of issues across sectors when it comes to environment, and we have to be mindful of these issues because as and when you have these M&A transactions, you have these issues crop up once in a while. Speaking of the regulatory environment, and of course, if you talk about the system of regulation as such, the laws in India primarily when it comes to environment are the central laws, and they remain uniform throughout the country. We of course have a whole lot of statutory authorities, starting with the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, the Central Pollution Control Board, the State Pollution Control Boards, and the Pollution Control Committees. And apart from that, you also have various other statutory authorities which actually deal with the specific aspects when it comes to the regulation of environment in India. And now, India is one of those very few countries. Actually, it's one of the 3 countries in the world which has a specialized tribunal to take care of environmental issues. And we have the National Green Tribunal, which actually came into effect in 2010, and it actually deals with all issues where a substantial question relating to environment is involved. And it has the power to impose fines, ensure that there is remediation and all of that. Apart from the National Green Tribunal, and of course, the appeals from the National Green Tribunal go on to the Supreme Court of India. But even apart from that, you have the high courts which are there in all the states in India, and you have the Supreme Court. And there's something called a writ jurisdiction, which actually allows the parties to sort of like approach the high courts or the Supreme Court, when it comes to these issues with respect to environment. So that is pretty much broadly the regulatory framework when it comes to regulation of environment in India. Speaking of the laws, so of course we have quite a few legislations, related rules, notifications, and everything. And in that light, the Environment Protection Act of 1986 becomes important because this is, of course, the umbrella legislation which empowers the concerned authorities to frame laws, of course, and the Parliament to frame laws. And this primarily includes these rules and the notifications on various aspects. Then, of course, you have the the Water Act and the Air Act, and they're extremely important because when these consents to operate are actually issued, these are the major legislations which come into play. And these legislations also provide for the power for these state pollution control boards to issue closure orders and a whole lot of other powers when it comes to inspection, seeking information from the companies, and So, and what is important is all these legislations, be it the Environment Act, the Air Act, or the Water Act, they actually provide for a whole lot of fines and even imprisonment. And of late, in the last few years, we've had a lot of instances where certain criminal proceedings have been initiated by these authorities against the directors of the company or officials who are seen to be in control of the management of the affairs of the company, operation of the industries, and all that. The National Green Tribunal Act, of course, is the most important piece of legislation right now because, like I mentioned, it deals with all. There are 7 legislations which are mentioned in the schedule to this act, and what it provides for is any issue which involves a substantial question relating to environment. It deals with those issues. While there are, of course, specific amounts which are mentioned, and there's also a limit which is mentioned in the statute. The tribunal, as such, has completely utilize its discretion to impose very hefty fines, which are seen to be having a deterrent effect on the companies which are on the which have erred when it comes to environment and have been polluting industries. So I think National Green Tribunal Act has made a lot of difference when it comes to compliance with environmental laws in India.
Right, we now move to the second section of this webinar titled Best Practices in Evaluation and Allocating Risks, and we'll be covering the following issues as part of this section. I'll now speak about some of the diligence scoping related issues, and I think one of the main important points is to have focus on the key issues, the material issues that may be relevant to your transaction, and not get lost in non-material issues. And then I think it's also important to think about the look-back period that the environment diligence exercise should contain. While it's very common to have a 3-year, 5-year look-back period for other corporate regulatory matters, for environmental matters that may not be enough, and we may have to go back much beyond the standard 3 to 5 years for environmental matters. Searches, inquiries are also important. If information is not forthcoming from the seller due to the deal dynamics, it is possible to approach authorities and get some information on environmental issues concerning a particular property. The sequence or the approach on diligence is also important. Does that include desktop reviews only, or would it include stage 1 and stage 2 diligence items? Is something that needs to be factored into, and we'll be dealing with these issues later in this webinar. I think some of the other important items are site inspection, that always will give you more perspective and insight on how things are actually handled by a target. And finally, I think information request lists, which are properly drafted, management questionnaires and interviews also go a long way.
Thanks, Aditya. I think, Aditya, you captured it absolutely correctly. There are a lot of things to be captured as part of process of doing a diligence. Now, I think it's extremely critical that while we try and understand and entangle environmental risk associated with business, critical and material issues related to environmental risk are appropriately captured at a very early stage, and the further investigation has to be done based on those specific material issues. Now, this could vary from sector to sector and from deal size to deal size or deal type to deal type. But broadly, I think material issues are the key things to be focused on. Now, while we do this diligence work, it is typically done in a staged approach, where the initial stage, which is the stage 1, captures about broadly 50 to 100 discrete areas which may have a material implication on the business. And some of these issues can vary from client to client and sector to sector and deal size and deal type to deal type. There are various ways of doing this. There are various international processes and guidelines and procedures which are well laid out. Some of them include ASTM standards, IFC performance standards, World Bank standards, and a specific lender associated standards which may be applicable specifically in case of project financing. A broad overview of laws which are applicable to or Indian laws and international laws which are applicable for that particular transaction is also one of the things that are typically done. While we understand and some of the things Aditya already captured, while we understand that there are certain ways of doing these things, typical process and would include discussion with management, the review of information memorandums, doing site visits and doing and getting some ground truthing about the factual information what is happening at site. Discussion with community, local regulators are some of the things which are extremely critical. Some of the other things that are also undertaken are some of the secondary data review, which is through either through Google searches or using proprietary platforms where you can get specific information about our governance or reputational or related risk associated with the target in discussion. While we do all this stuff and try and identify material risk, some of the key things that we have observed currently in Indian M&A scenario is our risk associated with regulatory non-compliances, water supply related issues, waste management issues. We have seen some of the sites getting closure notices because of improper management of hazardous waste, environmental releases, which basically are related to the leaks and dumps and other associated releases that happens with the environment into land, water, surface water, or neighboring areas of the site. While we capture all this stuff, I'll quickly move on to the next stage, next slide. While we capture and identify all this material risk, I'm going to quickly talk about the material risk that we typically encounter in an M&A scenario, which is about environmental releases. And we have seen a lot of cases in recent past, and we currently are working on some of the projects as well, that because of environmental releases and because of these red flags that have been identified, sometimes this can be showstoppers, or this could delay the whole process of transaction. So it's very prudent to have a robust data about nature and extent of impact because of these environmental releases at a very early stage, so that appropriate identification and quantification of those risks could be undertaken, and appropriate risk allocation and provisioning can be made as we move on through the negotiation stage. So that is the second stage that we're talking about. In case if there is a contamination that has been identified, further cleanup action is typically undertaken, which is basically a tiered approach. So there is a systematic process of identifying and evaluating the nature, extent, risk to human health, risk to community, risk to local environment, and the broader environment in the region. That all goes into the tiered approach and a model is created, which is typically capturing the sources, pathways, and receptors, and moving on from there. Further remedial action plan is prepared based and cleanup goals which are very specific to site specific are undertaken. Now, as part of this, moving on from this for this cleanup, I think it's typically done in a series of activities. So apart from developing a risk assessment model, we also need to be cognizant of fact about other considerations like regulatory considerations. Considerations may include pressures from community and their needs, and also about how far the contamination has gone from site to the off-site areas. So all these things come into play to really come out with identifying appropriate remedial techniques. Some of the techniques that we have used in India are about in-situ treatment, ex-situ treatment, containing migration to off-site areas, and some physical, chemical, and biological technologies. So, in nutshell, moving on back to as to why this is important at this stage is to really create a scenario where we can actually identify one of the biggest material risks that we envisage in M&A scenario, and further support can be given to client and their counsels on risk allocation and provisioning of those risks.
Right, now I'll speak about some of the contractual risk allocation related issues. And clearly, allocation often is a function of the type of the transaction or the parties' relative bargaining powers or risk appetite. Scope of environmental representations and warranties are often guided by the diligence exercise. Law does not contractually require the seller to make disclosures, and therefore it's important that appropriate representation warranties are identified pursuant to the diligence exercise and disclosures are closely looked at. Environmental indemnities are another item to be looked into. While you will benefit from indemnities for breaches of environmental reps and warranties, specific indemnities are also often opted for, especially when the environmental concern cannot be quantified. Allocation of risk to buyer can be in multiple forms or to the seller, and this may mean either a full or a partial sharing between the parties. It could mean a direct price adjustment, which is done upfront to reflect the risk that has been identified, or liability for pre-closing and continuing non-compliances may be contractually agreed between the parties to be shared in a particular manner. There's also a sliding scale of liability, which is often adopted by the parties to deal with certain environmental issues. Remediation, once, of course, it has been identified, one of the critical questions that comes to mind is, should the remediation be done as a condition precedent or a condition subsequent? Of course, there are various factors to consider in terms of the deal timelines, the dynamics of the deal, or the timelines for the remediation. However, given the fact that there is no law dealing with historical pollution in India, as a buyer, it is imperative that you require any material environmental issues to be remediated as a condition precedent. And to give you an example, we've had scenarios where we had identified remediation of soil as a condition precedent. However, due to the deal dynamics, parties agreed to deal with that as a condition subsequent and move to closing. And right after closure, inspections were carried out by governmental authorities. And since the remediation process was underway, this led to stoppage of operation and levy of fines and penalties. So therefore, it's important to analyze the risks that may come to that may arise out of your decision to deal with a remediation issue as a condition subsequent rather than a condition precedent. Funded and unfunded or liability, funded unfunded indemnities is also an important aspect. When parties agree to not make a pricing adjustment upfront, you may decide to have funded indemnities so that you are equally protected should any environmental risk finally materialize. Another important risk allocation product that's been picking up of late is insurance. A lot of Indian insurance companies are now providing products to deal with environment contamination, including remedial or non-compliance related issues. So therefore, it's important to consider this product in your risk allocation methodology. Finally, I think contractual identification of officer in default or occupier which are concepts that are entrenched under relevant Indian laws, will go a long way, because very often Indian laws will link the liability of certain events on the officer in default or the occupier, and therefore it's important to contractually identify them. We'll now move to the third section of this webinar, which is titled Risk Mitigation Strategies, and we'll be dealing with the following issues as part of this section. Right, on preemptive strategies, I think it's very important to be proactive rather than reactive. It is important to stress test the target's environmental, health, and safety framework, not only in line with the current regulatory framework, also the future framework, and at times it's also required to look at it against the buyer's own framework, because post-closing there will face integration issues, and therefore it's always helpful to plan for these items upfront. I think the second important aspect is planning for the evolving regulatory regime and engaging in formal future risk mitigation strategies, because that will really help you preempt any environmental risks and liabilities in your transaction. The due diligence defense, while it is not entrenched under Indian law as regards environmental issues are concerned, certain Indian case laws do support this proposition. There are also specific environmental laws which provide for safe harbor provisions, and therefore it is important to be diligent, have processes and systems, reportings, so that these issues can be appropriately looked at. Structuring workarounds are also important preemptive strategy. For example, when we were representing a foreign client in their proposed acquisition of a subsidiary of an Indian listed company engaged in manufacturing of heavy equipments, during the diligence, we figured out that the target also engaged in nuclear business, which is supplying of certain parts to the nuclear industry. Given that the client was not engaged in nuclear business and there were material risks involved with the nuclear business, we had to come up with a strategy to deal with the scenario. And finally, we ended up structuring the deal as an asset transfer rather than a share transfer. So it's important to engage with consultants and advisors during the stage of the deal negotiation, so that appropriate structures can be brought to the table and parties can benefit from that. Finally, I think implementation of a compliance program and engaging with the right people during the life cycle of the project is also very important. And it's important, therefore, to have trusted advisors, external and internal, advising the management on these issues.
Speaking of risk mitigation strategies, and especially from a liability perspective, I think one of the important things that has to be kept in mind by the parties is, of course, the consents and clearances. And when we speak about the consents and clearances, I think the first important clearance that should be taken care of, and subject to, of course, its applicability in the context of the specific industry and the scale of manufacture, etc., is the environmental clearance, which is, of course, provided by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And so this, of course, is a one-time clearance which is required, but then please do keep in mind that it has certain specific and general conditions which have to be complied with. And if not done appropriately, then it's very likely that it can even be sort of like revoked. Then, of course, you need the consent to establish from the concerned state pollution control board or the pollution control committee. And this is, of course, like it says, that it's a consent to establish. And once you've set it up and then you want to sort of like start the operations, you have to go to the concerned pollution control board and seek the consent to operate. Now, consent to operate, of course, again, has certain specific and general conditions depending on the nature of the activity that the industry plans to undertake. and has to be renewed from time to time. If not done appropriately, then of course the Pollution Control Board has all powers to revoke the consent to operate, and that means closure. Usually, you have the consent under the Air Act and the Water Act, which is provided by the Pollution Control Board, and many times it's a combined consent, which also includes your hazardous waste consent. Few of the states actually have it separate. Most others have it as a combined consent. The other important the consent which is required is, of course, the no objection certificate from the Central Groundwater Authority. And last month, the National Green Tribunal has actually passed an order where it has said that if you're falling in any of these areas which are either critical, water critical, or overexploited area, then there is no NOC that would be granted by CGWA, which is the Central Groundwater Authority, for any expansion till the time, of course, the water levels in those areas are replenished and restored. So having said that, I think depending on the nature of the activity and also depending on the location, there are certain other clearances and consents which are applicable. For example, you have the Coastal Regulation Zone clearance, which is provided by the Coastal Zone Management Authority. And of course, if you have one of those industries operating in one of these areas which fall in the CRZ area, then that would be applicable. So this broadly is the framework when it comes to consents and clearances in India.
All right, thank you everyone. This has been really a very engaging session, and so thank you to the panelists. And now is our time for the Q&A. And I would like to remind you that the web portal is still open. So in case if you have questions, please feel free to post them and we'll be taking those up. And if we are not able to get to them today, we will respond to them offline in case if there are more than that. We've already received several questions, and let me just start. The first question that we have is it market practice to give representations relating to equator principle IFC performance standards in loan documents, especially in the Indian context, and link it to event of default? And I would, Aditya, would you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I think it's fairly common to have these kind of requirements in Indian deals as well, especially when these requirements are applicable to the investor. Then they want to ensure that the target also complies with this. So yes, it is fairly common.
Great, thank you. I think the next question, and this may be more relevant for Navneet, is how were environmental liabilities dealt with in the Union Carbide case, and what has been the march of case law since then?
So, of course, the regime, like I mentioned during the course of the presentation also, that we've actually moved on to a regime which is talking about absolute liability. So I think we have complete clarity to that extent that, that if it's any of these industries which are actually dealing with stuff which is inherently dangerous, then absolute liability is the norm. And most of the judgments, rather all of the judgments thereafter, have pretty much. So earlier the regime used to be strict liability, and of course now we've moved to absolute liability. And so that is the norm, and there is no deviation as such. And there are no exceptions. So and earlier there have been exceptions which companies have claimed, but now there is no exceptions. If you are one of those industries dealing with substances which are inherently dangerous and which pose serious risks to environment, then absolute liability is the norm.
Great, thank you. I think the next question is also, I think, more Navneet and Rahul. The audience have asked that, can you please give us a brief overview of the compliance requirements relating to groundwater usage and groundwater discharge pollution, and the nature of liabilities in the event of breach of such compliance requirements, civil, criminal, if any?
So, so let me just start off by saying that we mentioned about, so if you're talking about the issue of usage of groundwater, then of course, yes, like I mentioned that, you have to have the NOC, which is the no objection certificate from the Central Groundwater Authority. And again, depending on which area you're located in, if you're in one of those water critical areas or overexploited areas, then of course, it's likely that you may not get it unless, of course, the water levels are restored and all of that. And I think the later part of the question, if I remember correctly, was to do with the whole question of pollution of groundwater and such issues.
Yes.
So of course, now ZLD, like I mentioned in one of the slides, the zero liquid discharge, that's the norm. So all industries, irrespective of your nature of activity, and especially if you're sort of like one of those active industries which actually discharge effluents, then you have to just make sure that everything is treated properly, and the treated water, whatever, they're actually used for gardening in your premises and all of that. So the idea, of course, being that there is absolutely, like the name suggests, zero liquid discharge from your premises. And Rahul, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'll quickly add to the second bit of the question, which is about groundwater contamination. I think groundwater contamination, I think if you just go back a little while, I think in 2016, CPCB, which is a Central Pollution Control Board, which is a technical body under the ministry, has issued specific guidelines to manage the environmental damages and associated cost for that. Now, this guideline is pretty comprehensive in nature. From beginning, it captures as to what is the process of doing it, what is the process of managing that contamination, and if there is a contamination, what could be the potential, what are the key techniques that should be used to correct that contamination. There are clear laws in India which suggest that if there is a contamination, a certain forthwith information has to be disclosed, and appropriate disclosures have to be made to authorities. With that, once the disclosure is done, they may also have to give, at some point of time, a clear action plan to clean up the site or to clean up the contamination if that has been originated from that site.
On the just to add on the liability issue, because I think the question also had the liability. So if it's one of the cases where so one of the regular practices which the National Green Tribunal has been following of late is that they usually constitute a committee, and committee actually comprises of, say, representatives from the pollution control boards and other technical bodies, and they actually have an assessment done, and depending on the nature or the scale of the damage that has been caused, the quantum or the amount of fine is actually calculated. In fact, let me just also add that CPCB has very recently come up with a formula which actually provides for all the factors that have to be taken into consideration when it comes to determination of this compensation amount, and that is now being followed. So when it comes to the liability bit, of course, like I mentioned in one of the slides, it's the operator or the occupier, and more recently, when we talk about occupier, it's the directors, which are usually seen to be occupiers as such. But for quite some time, the norm has been that it's the official who's in charge of the day-to-day activities, who's believed to be aware of the activities which are being carried out at a particular site, is usually held accountable when it comes to the company.
So I think, Navneet, you're second guessing the audience here, because the next question I have from the audience is exactly on the occupier point. And it is fairly common, and we also receive it all the time when you're dealing with manufacturing or any factory establishment. The question is, can all directors on a board be held liable as occupier under environmental laws, including independent and nominee directors?
All right. So you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I
Yes,
can start and you can probably add. I think the default rule is, for instance, the Factories Act will prescribe that an occupier must be appointed. And the default rule is that the occupier must be a director on the board of the company. Now, if a director has, if an occupier has not been identified, then of course the authorities can go to the board and hold those people responsible for an issue. However, as long as the board is not aware of a particular matter and has not knowingly or unknowingly responsible for a non-compliance, they may not be held liable. Navneet, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think the example you said is perfectly right, and that's more from, I think, in labor law, the clarity is of course there. So environment, what has happened typically is for quite some time, like I mentioned, that we've had the operator occupier being held liable, and so the first part of the question, of course, it's the directors who are, of course, made accountable. But if they can actually show that there was no way in which say X or Y, being the director of the company, would have known as to that certain activities have been carried out, and it's likely that it would have led to pollution. So then of course someone has to be held accountable. So then it's, of course, the official, whoever who's in charge of the day-to-day activities. But yes, the directors, of course, are seen as occupiers, even in the environmental law context. The labor law, in the context of labor law, of course, the clarity is, of course, there. In environment, it's occupier operator. But I would say in 90% of the cases, 95% of the cases, when the proceedings are initiated, it's the directors who are actually held accountable.
And absolutely, and just to add there, I mean, that is the reason why you would have a detailed compliance framework and ensure that and mitigate that all steps are taken well in advance. And this is what the webinar initially discussed, so that you don't have to sort of deal with such unforeseen or unfortunate incidents. The next question that we have is from the audience is, what is the typical look back period of an environmental diligence?
Right, so this is something that I touched upon as part of my presentation, and I think there's no clear answer to this. This is something that you will be able to conclusively decide on only after you have done the scoping work. For instance, if there are real estate properties involved, then it is very standard to look at prior usage of those property as well, in order to assess environmental risks appropriately. So this is basically a function of the planning process, but this is typically much more beyond than the 3 to 5 year look back period which you may have for other diligence work streams.
I think the next question that I have right now is, what are the typical costs for remedial activities for cleanup of sites and facilities?
It's a very difficult question, good question though. See, based on our experience of working in India for about more than 30 remediation projects, I think that the cost varies a lot, and there are reasons for that. Cost can vary from potentially Indian rupees 50 lakh, which is of 5 million rupees, to about order of magnitude, which could be 25 crore Indian rupees, or 30 crore Indian rupees, which could be about 250 to 300 million rupees. Now there are factors which are driving these variation in cost. Obviously, the risk appetite, the size of the company, the nature of impact, extent of impact, the technical things like geology, hydrogeology, the off-site impacted parties, receptors, all those things have to be understood well before we come out with a remedial plan and prepare a remediation strategy. Please remember, this is a costly affair and this is a time-consuming affair. So the typical remediation project could run for years as well before we actually achieve a cleanup criteria or a cleanup goal that was desired in the beginning.
Thank you, Rahul. And I think next one is also a very interesting question that we've received, and it's pretty common when we are dealing with asset transfer situations where you're not going with the standard approach but transferring or buying out the business as opposed to shares. Is that, are there restrictions on transfer of environmental permits pursuant to an M&A transaction?
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's a good question, and we have to deal with this in any asset transfer, business transfer structures. Typically, environmental consents approvals are transferable, and the process will be fairly simple and will entail submission of a no objection certificate by the existing management or target, and an undertaking from the new management, new company acquirer. And then there are certain processes and documentation in order to complete the transfer process, and there are certain nominal fees that has to be paid. But yes, they are typically transferable.
We have another interesting question, and which is asking for a ballpark estimate of what is the percentage of deals where you see comprehensive EDDs being undertaken.
I can start, and maybe you can pitch in. Uh, if I just see a transition from last 10 years, I think there is a significant increase in doing to start with environmental diligence, but there are broader aspects also covered as part of the diligence, which is broadly ESG aspects, which may be based on various global frameworks that are applicable. So yes, we have seen a shift in doing this on a mandatory basis. Uh, but really it depends on the appetite of clients. Sometimes if there are smaller deals, if there are sectors which doesn't have any footprint, obviously it's not done. But in certain sectors which have heavy footprint of ESG related issues, we see that it's done on a compulsory basis and as a mandatory item.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, I think it's really a question of what industry you're dealing with. Of course, industries are categorized into various classes, and if you are an industry that is exposed to excessive environmental legislation, then environment due diligence in some form or the other is a must. Whether that's a desktop review, phase one review, phase two review, is essentially fleshed out during the scoping process.
So very little time remaining, but we do have some time for some more questions. So please keep posting those. Another question that has come in is, do Indian regulators keep public register of environmental information? What is the procedure for a third party to search those registers?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share my views on this. I think yes, there are periodic filings and records that are maintained with governmental authorities, while environmental laws typically will not provide for a mechanism for a third party to request the authorities to provide such information. There are other ways by which such information can be procured. And as I had alluded previously in my presentation, it is possible for third parties to approach governmental authorities under what we call the Right to Information Act and request for information that is maintained with them. So yes, it's possible. There may be some limitations and some limitations to this, but yes, it is possible.
So just to add to what they just mentioned, so we've had instances where, depending on the nature of the industry or whatever, if they want to see us, what are the terms and conditions, what are the emission norms, etc., applicable for a similar industry, and which say an industry which is planning to sort of set shop in that particular sector, whatever wants to know. So to be honest, I mean, our pollution control authorities or the boards have not been that organized because. But of late, we understand that a lot of these documents are actually being uploaded, and that's not very common. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of not all that easy either to get the copies of, say, consent of another industry or whatever. But I think so far as the basic norms and everything is to be found out, I think that's still possible.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think if one were to look at very site-specific information, as Aditya mentioned, there are ways to do that, but a lot of times it does take time in M&A scenario. Also, the lot of information is not at one place. Sometimes we have some platform or databases that a ministry maintains or a CPCB maintains, which may have only some information about, let's say, waste information. So information is also fragmented. And is also divided among various government authorities. Yes, so in a nutshell, yes, we can get some information, but it may take some time, and we may not also get all the information in one place.
Thank you, panelists. We have run out of time for the Q&A now, and in case if you still have questions, you may feel free to reach any of us on the contact details that are with you. Or email us, and we'd be happy to respond to them offline. Just to now sort of conclude in terms of key takeaways, I think the panel has made it very clear that, given the absolute liability regime, given the reputational risks involved, given the M&A, which it is meant itself to be a long-term horizon, a long-term partnership, a long-term strategy decision. Therefore, in that context, environment liabilities are extremely important, given the various what we've heard from panel today. So I would say identify, document, and understand. These are the three goals that you need to sort of look at from a documentation perspective. Thank you all for the participation in this webinar. Thank you.